Hello again, everybody. So, I've been brewing New Zealand Pilsners quite a bit recently, and the last couple that I've done have actually fared pretty well in some competitions. So, in this video, I want to talk a little bit about the style and how those recipes are put together and basically share that with you so you can hopefully go and brew some really good New Zealand Pilsners, which I think are great beers. It's a great beer style, especially if you're into New Zealand hops and showcasing the great flavours that you can get from those varieties. So, one beer that I'm going to share with you today won the UK Smash Off competition, and the other beer came second in its class in the London Amateur Brewers Open Homebrew competition, which happened the other month. So yeah, let's get into those recipes and we can talk about New Zealand Pilsners and hopefully give you some tips on how to make a really good one. So before we get into the beers themselves, let's just do a quick overview of the style guidelines and a little bit of history on the New Zealand Pilsner itself. So it's a relatively new category in the BJCP style guidelines, but the beer itself obviously originates from New Zealand, and the first examples of it did come about around about the mid-90s. So most people would cite Emerson's Brewery, who are a brewery in Dunedin in New Zealand, as the company that first produced the New Zealand Pilsner to showcase New Zealand hops like Nelson, Sauvin and so on. So back to the BJCP guidelines, this is category X5 New Zealand Pilsner. Overall impression, a pale, dry, golden coloured, cleanly fermented beer showcasing the characteristic tropical, citrusy, fruity, grassy New Zealand type hops. Medium body, soft mouthfeel and smooth palate and finish with a neutral to bready malt base, providing the support for this very drinkable, refreshing, hop-forward beer. Sounds great already just from the description on there, to be fair, doesn't it? So I'm not going to go through everything on the guidelines here, but we'll just skip down to the vital statistics and we'll put those up on the screen. So IBUs normally between 25 and 45, SRM 2 to 6 in terms of colour, original gravity 1044 to 1056, final gravity 1009 to 1014, giving you an ABV range between 4.5% to 5.8%. So essentially pretty similar to most of the other kind of Pilsner styles in terms of the vital statistics. But obviously the big difference here is we've got a big whack of New Zealand hops in there, giving a lot of flavour and aroma characteristic of those varieties. And we are talking about, from this, the varieties which are going to give you more of those kind of tropical and fruity flavours, such as your Nelsons, Motuikas, Rawakas and so on. So I'll come back to some more specifics on the ingredients and composition of the recipe as I go through the two beers that we're going to look at in terms of the ones that I brewed myself. So let's start off with the smash beer. So this was showcasing Rawaka hops, which is why I've imaginatively named it Smashawaka, and it's obviously a smash beer, so the recipe is pretty simple, but we've got 4.8 kilograms of floor malted Bohemian Pilsner malt. Now, that is a very high quality Pilsner malt from Veemans, and it's quite expensive, especially in the UK at the minute as a result. With the amount of hops that go into this beer, it's probably not essential that you have the, best quality premium Pilsner malt going into it. But as this was a smash beer, I wanted to make sure that all of the ingredients that I were using were the best quality at the time. So let's get this into a glass. And this one has been in the fridge for quite a while. This is actually the last bottle of this that I have, and it was bottled off the keg, but it looks like it's got great condition on it still. So you can see the colour on that is a nice sort of honey pale straw colour. The floor malted Pilsner malt does seem to give you a really nice colour even when you are using it just on its own like that. Very lively carbonation in there, and on the aroma it's just a real nice passion fruit, melony, a little bit of grape in there as well. So I think Rawaka does have some notes which are quite similar to Nelson hops. And there's a kind of sweet malt bready base there underneath. It smells good. So I'm quite pleased that this bottle still seems, certainly from the aroma, to be in good condition. Let's just talk through the recipe a little bit more before I get into drinking this one. So as I said, 4.8 kilos of floor malted Bohemian Pilsner. This is for a 20 litre batch, which gives us a original gravity of 1054. Final gravity was supposed to come out at 1014. I think it ended up a little bit lower than that. So the ABV should be calculated as about 5.3%. I think mine came out just a smidge higher than that. So it was about 5.4, I think I got in the end. Obviously, colour-wise, it's going to be very low in terms of EVC value because it's only a single malt, so you don't really need to worry about that. And IBUs, I had mine at 37 for this. So on to the hopping. Again, obviously all Rawaka hops all the way through. I put 15 grams in at 60 minutes. These particular hops were 6.3% alpha acids. So that can obviously be adjusted depending on what percentage you get for yours if you want to make this recipe in order to hit the 37 IBUs. And the 60-minute charge would be the one that I would suggest you adjust to alter that. So 20 minutes into the boil, 20 grams of Rawaka, 5 minutes in, 30 grams of Rawaka, and then a 20-minute whirlpool with 60 grams of Rawaka at 80 degrees C. I did also dry hop this beer with 40 grams of Rawaka, and one thing I will say for this recipe and the one that I did for the lab competition is that I think dry hopping wise, I would say that's kind of optional. So basically, if you want a little bit more subtlety and a little bit more traditional Pilsner character, then that's possibly something that you can take out of the recipe. Whereas when you have got the dry hops in there as well, it can lean the balance a little bit more towards what you might expect from a pale ale, a hoppy pale ale, or even an IPA. That said, you know, it still tastes great to me. So it's up to you, but that's one thing I would say is optional. Yeast, I used Imperial Yeast L17. So again, one of the reasons I wanted to do that is that yeast is really good full stop anyway, but it does drop out quite nicely. It's quite a high flocculation lager yeast, so you get a nice crystal clear kind of finish with the beer without usually having to use too many finings, even if you have dry hopped, as long as the dry hop isn't too crazy. And it also works well under pressure, so this was a pressure fermented beer. It was a single infusion mash, so some people will say that you should be doing step mashes and all of that with Pilsner malts. In this case I didn't, so single infusion at 67 degrees C. And the only other thing to mention really is water profile. So I went for starting with RO water, as I almost always do, a very soft water profile, which ended up with essentially 2.5 grams each of calcium chloride and gypsum, and that gave me a final water profile of about 44 ppm calcium, 42 chloride and 49 sulfate. So just enough really to get the calcium levels up and keep the other two main minerals there balanced between the two. So in the description style guidelines, it does talk about if you're going to go soft, potentially having more balance towards chloride as well. So I've done water profiles for lagers before where I've literally just used calcium chloride and not even bothered with any gypsum, and that's actually worked really well too. So for me, with the lager water profiles, just keep it as simple as you can. You don't need to be adding all the different water minerals and salts and all the rest of it. As long as you've got a decent amount of calcium in there and you're keeping the overall levels very soft, it should produce a decent result like this. So let's get back to this beer. Now, there is a video from John Campbell, Red Dog Brewer, who actually judged the competition. So don't just take my word for it. Go and check out the link, which I'll post above, for his video where he judged the two beers from the Smash competition, and obviously one of those was this one. There's a lovely malt sweetness straight out, but then it's just Rawaka hops, which are a really great hop variety. If you haven't tried them before, I recommend giving them a go, even if it's not in this beer. Use them in pale ales and IPAs and things like that. They're fantastic. But there's passion fruit, there's definitely melon, there's some other kind of like herbal notes in there as well, maybe a bit of like lemongrass, lime zest, so the typical kind of New Zealand hop character, or the calling card of New Zealand hops, if you will, for me, that kind of lime zest note. Nice dry finish, although it's quite sweet initially. There's a nice dry finish, so a good whack of bitterness. Again, I think having those IBUs in the higher 30s or even into the 40s is quite important for me for pilsners generally, but especially beers like this where you're trying to balance a little bit of that sweetness and also the fruity flavors from the hops. And I think the yeast does help to just bring out a little bit of the malt as well. So harvest yeast, clearly it still allows quite a bit of hop flavor to come through, but it definitely also brings out a lot of malt character in the beer, which in a smash beer like this especially I think is quite important. And again, I wanted to use a good quality ingredient here with it being a smash beer to get the most out of the yeast. So 3470 and the liquid equivalents are brilliant, I think, for New Zealand Pilsners, and it's the one that I use in the other recipe. But this yeast will just give you a little bit more character from the malt, and I thought with it being a smash beer, that was a good option to go for. So yeah, that is beer number one, the smash version of a New Zealand Pilsner, and it's bloody lovely still. So I'm going to just polish that off, and then we'll move on to the next beer. So you go to do the video, and would you believe it, that is literally the last of this beer that's left as well. So clearly I've been enjoying this beer a little bit too much too, and maybe should have checked the level in the keg before I did this, but at least there's enough there just about for me to do a little bit of tasting. Not that I need to, because I've obviously drunk so much of it that I could tell you about it anyway. But before I get into this recipe, I'll just let you know that this has literally, as I'm recording this video, just been launched on the Brew website as well as a kit beer. So obviously you can follow the recipe that I'm going to give you on this video, but if you want to save yourself the hassle, do go over to Brew and purchase the kit beer from them. I'll put a link to that in the description. I sent the guys at Brew a few of my beers, which included one of these, and they liked it enough that they wanted to put it on the site as a kit. So I didn't ask them to do that. That was their idea, and I'm pretty pleased with that as well as the fact that it came second in the competition. The rosette for that's up the wall back there, by the way, just in case you were wondering. So let's get into the recipe for this one. The numbers are pretty similar to the previous beer. A couple of slight differences. It's not a smash, this one, so obviously the grain bill is a little bit more complex, but still pretty straightforward. So we'll start with that, and it's 3.8 kilograms of Pilsner malt. I did use on this one actually a mixture of Pilsner malt, floor malted Pilsner malt, and a more standard kind of lager or Pilsner malt, I think. Again, I don't think it's massively important that you use the best quality Pilsner or lager malts for these because of the high hop character and flavour. It's going to mask that a little bit, but obviously, you know, if you really want a good quality malt base kind of flavour coming through, then sometimes it's worth looking at options like floor malted varieties and so on. So a total of 3.8 kilos of Pilsner or lager malt, 200 grams of Carapils in there just for a little bit of extra head retention and maybe a touch more body, and 200 grams of light Munich malt. So both of those, that's just under 5% of the total grist. And again, the Munich malt there is just going to add a little bit more complexity, maybe a touch more bready and malty flavour to the mix, as well as just bringing the colour up very slightly too. So that's the grain bill. This was for 20 litres, by the way. So as I said, numbers wise, a little bit similar. I did use global yeast on this one, which is a liquid equivalent of 3470, or the Vine Stefano yeast, which finishes a little bit lower gravity wise. So although the ABV is about the same as the previous beer, the original gravity is slightly less at 1049, and the FG, or predicted final gravity, is about 1008. So you still end up with about 5.4% beer, so about the same in terms of alcohol. IBUs 37. Again, I think with this style, for me personally, I like the bitterness to be a little bit more prominent, just to balance out the fruity and sweet flavours from the hops. And speaking of which, getting into the hops, there's a combination of 3 New Zealand hops here. Green Bullet, which is classically used as a bittering hop. It can be used in ales and things like that as well. And I've just got that in as a bittering addition at 60 minutes because of the slightly higher alpha acids. Nelson Sauvin is obviously the main feature hop of this one, and then it's supported by some Wakatu hops as well, which are basically a Hallertau variety that's been kind of grown in New Zealand and taken on some of the characteristics of hops which are locally grown there. So we have 6 grams of Green Bullet at 60 minutes. Then at 10 minutes left, we've got 10 grams of Nelson, 10 grams of Wakatu. At 5 minutes left, we've got 20 grams of Nelson, 10 grams of Wakatu. And then another 20-minute whirlpool with 40 grams of Nelson and 20 grams of Wakatu. I think I did this one at 75 rather than 80 for some reason. Can't remember why I decided to drop it slightly on this particular beer, but we've got a total of 60 grams of hops there in the whirlpool, and then 50 grams of Nelson added as a dry hop. The dry hop on both of these beers, in the recipe it says 3 days, but that's essentially me putting the hops in once I've cooled them down to 14 degrees C after fermentation is fully completed, and leaving them for about a day, and then I'll start the cold crash on day 2 and then leave it for at least another 24 hours for the hops and everything else to drop out of suspension on that 3rd and maybe even the 4th day, depending on how it goes. So that was the hop schedule. As I said, I fermented this with Imperial Global yeast, which is an equivalent to 3470, and various other liquid versions of the same yeast that you can get. Mash temp was 66 degrees on this beer. That contributed a little bit to the slightly lower FG, I think, on this one, but mostly it's down to the yeast being a little bit more attenuative. And then water profile, again, very soft. I did favour the chloride a little bit more on this one, so I think I did look at the style guidelines, took note of the mention of favouring chloride and just up to that level. So on this one, I put in 3 grams of calcium chloride versus 1.3 grams of gypsum, and that gave me a final water profile of 40 ppm calcium, 52 chloride, and 26 on the sulfate. I don't bother with any of the other minerals or salts like Epsom salts or just normal salt, so table salt for the water profile for lagers, because I don't really think it's necessary. Personally, make your own mind up on that one. So again, this was also pressure fermented, and I did do it, or at least a portion of the fermentation, at higher temperatures. If you're going to do it with a more normal lager schedule, obviously you would want to extend the fermentation time and keep it cooler, but 3470 or the Weihenstephaner yeast is very temperature tolerant, so you can get away with fermenting it just warm anyway without pressure. Or if you do have pressure fermentation, you can speed up the process even more and get it done really quick and really clean. Coming back to the yeast, I've obviously used proper lager yeast on both of these, although I've pressure fermented and done them warm, but there are options with New Zealand Pilsners to go for kind of hybrid style yeast. So you could use like Kolsch yeast, or dare I say it, even one of the clean Quake varieties like your Lutra. But for me, I would personally always favour the traditional lager yeast because of the just crisper finish and the slightly drier flavour that you get from them, and it just tastes more like an authentic lager to me when you go down that route. So that's my personal preference, but lots of people will use those other kind of yeast varieties for these, and I believe some of the actual original commercial examples were in fact brewed with Kolsch yeast. Possibly the Emerson's Pilsner is actually brewed with a Kolsch, so technically not Pilsner, but anyway, you get the idea. So let me do a quick review of this. I'll put up a couple of the notes from the BJCP score sheets on the screen as well for this beer. So as I said, it was obviously judged by the BJCP guidelines at the competition. It's the last one out the keg, so it's maybe got a little bit of haze on it that wouldn't have been there otherwise. On the aroma, it's got that very grapey kind of Nelson edge to it, but there's a little bit of a spicy herbal note there as well. I think giving the Nelson one of the more traditional New Zealand varieties, not traditional, but one of the more noble style New Zealand varieties like Wakatu, can just add a little bit more depth to the flavour from the hops. But it is mostly that kind of grapey tropical flavour. It's quite, sometimes Nelson can be a very sort of dry, winey kind of aroma. This is a little bit more like of a juicy grape. And I think there's some kind of like honeydew melon in there perhaps, but yeah, it smells really good. Probably the malt is not as evident on the nose for me on this one as it was with the smash beer, which is interesting considering that the malt bill is actually more complex, but perhaps that's down to the yeast that I mentioned before. And then flavour wise, it's just lovely sweet malt base, but then dry crisp finish with the kind of grapey tropical Nelson hop notes coming to the fore, and then a little bit of a slightly more herbal note. It's very refreshing, it's quite dry, it's a great showcase for Nelson hops, and I'm gutted that that's the last of it in the keg, to be honest. So what can you do? I'm gonna have to brew some more of it basically. So there's the two beers there. I mean, just to sort of sum it up in terms of my take on this style as to what makes a good New Zealand Pilsner, I think try and keep it relatively dry and crisp, and for me a decent whack of bitterness is a good thing. You do need to have one of the more punchy New Zealand hop varieties as the kind of showcase hop in there. So Nelson Sauvin and Rawaka would be two of the main options for me. Motueka is a really good option as well. That's used in a lot of New Zealand Pilsners and generally hoppy lagers anyway. Again, it's got some SARS heritage to it, so just really fits that kind of lager style beer anyway. Yeast choice I've kind of talked about a bit. For me, lager yeast will give you that authentic kind of crisp Pilsner finish, but feel free to experiment with maybe some hybrid yeast like Kolsch or maybe Cali Common yeast, or even the cleaner Quake varieties as well. And as far as the malts go, a really simple smash style single malt recipe will work great. Getting the best quality Pilsner malt, although I've actually used some really nice Pilsner malt in both of these beers, I don't think is necessarily as crucial as it might be for more traditional lagers because of the dominance of the hop flavour. But yeah, I mean, pretty much just go with a kind of standard, relatively light kind of Pilsner style malt bill, and you should be good on that front as well. So yeah, that's it. If you've got any questions, stick them into the comments. If you've enjoyed this video, please support the channel by first making sure that you like the video and subscribe. And if you want to go a bit beyond that, maybe use the thanks button below to support the channel. And you can also use the affiliate links in the description as well to support me via the kind of Amazon and eBay links that I've posted there for various bits of equipment that I use. So that's it for this one, and I've enjoyed the very last dregs of this New Zealand Pilsner, and bid you goodbye. So cheers.
I'm the dude, so that's what you call me, you know? That or his dudeness, or duder, or you know, El Duderino if you're not into the whole brevity thing.